All right, folks. It's snowing in New Orleans. It's -50 in Minnesota. I saw a lady in the Target parking lot yesterday wearing a knee-length parka because it's so frigid in the Southern California area. The polar vortex is here. The deep freeze is here. And it's so bad, it's even affecting the rulemaking process. But contrary to popular belief, it does not affect CMMC. And today we're going to talk about why.
The world is freezing over, Jacob, and the world is freezing over because my Washington Commanders are on to the NFC Championship game. Run or pass and score, we want a lot more. Beat them, swamp them, touchdown. Let the points soar. Fight on till you have won. Sons of Washington, rah, rah, rah. Hail to the Washington Commanders. Let's go.
You almost had to ask for your line there. All right.
line
That's
please.
Great. Let's talk about this regulatory freeze memo because boy, oh boy, has it caused a lot of bad hot takes on LinkedIn and social media and a lot of misconceptions about what it means in general and what it means for CMMC specifically. Okay, so just to get it out of the way, the regulatory freeze memo affects rules pending publication and published rules that haven't taken effect. But the regulatory freeze memo does not affect CMMC directly because one CMMC rule is already in effect and the other isn't pending publication within the next 60 days. So let's talk about it. Like I said, the regulatory freeze memo affects rules pending publication and published rules that have not yet taken effect. This is the paraphrased version of the memo. We'll link it below. You can read it for yourself, but here's the quick version. Until a department or agency head appointed or designated by the president reviews and approves a given rule, 4 things. 1, no rules are to be proposed, issued, or sent to the office of the Federal Register or issued in any manner. 2, rules pending publication will be withdrawn so they can be reviewed and approved. 3, for any rules that have been published but have not yet taken effect, consider postponing the effective date for 60 days from the date of the memo, which would be March 21st of 2025, for the purpose of reviewing any questions of fact, law, and policy that may arise from the rules, that the rules may raise. And 4, following this postponement, no further action needs to be taken for those rules that raise no substantial questions of fact, law, or policy. That's what the regulatory freeze memo says. And basically everyone with an axe to grind against the CMMC program took the news of this regulatory freeze memo with no context, no real understanding of the rulemaking process, the status of the various CMMC rules, or the lengthy history of regulatory freeze memos as a normal practice in the broader landscape of rulemaking going all the way back to 2001. So that's what the memo says. And what do you think, Jason? What's your takeaway here?
So I think that reading is important. I think that comprehension is important. And I think that it's very important to see what has happened in history so we don't let history repeat itself, right? And unfortunately for us, I thought about this. We're kind of at this point like veterans of this, right? We're going through like our second cycle of this reiteration of like, oh my God, something new because I'm new, but I didn't really know that it already existed and things like that. So we are battling that once again. What I heard from that short introduction is that there are distinct qualifiers that any regulation that is currently in the process, if it's at a certain stage in their process, that this freeze actually affects it. But what I also heard in that introduction is that every rule that we should care about doesn't fit those requirements.
Correct.
It doesn't match the usual suspects, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about it in relation to CMMC specifically. That's what the people are here for. And
Sure.
I got to get back inside where it's warm, if you will. Anyways,
I don't think I've ever seen you wear a jacket.
I you know how long
you're gonna have heat stroke. Like I think
it took me forever to find this thing. It was in a box under the bed. I haven't seen this jacket in years. Anyways, back to the point. The regulatory freeze memo does not affect CMMC directly because one CMMC rule is already in effect and the other isn't pending publication within the next 60 days, the period of postponement from the freeze memo. So just to recap, there are two rules that implement CMMC, a program rule and a contract clause rule. The program rule codifies the overall CMMC program, the levels of the CMMC model, waivers, scoring, oversight, quality assurance, all the programmatic stuff for the CMMC program is in the program rule. The final program rule was published October 15th of 2024 and went into effect 60 days later on December 16th, 2024. You can see the regulation for yourself in black and white right now in the Code of Federal Regulations at Title 32, Section 170. We'll link it down in the description below. This is why the program rule is often referred to as the 32 CFR CMMC rule, because it's codified at Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It is a codified regulation. It is in effect. It is not pending publication. It's not pending going into effect. It's done. It's already on the books. It's in effect. There are companies right now getting CMMC level 2 certifications, either from their joint surveillance assessment results or through their own voluntary approach to paying a C3PAO for their assessment. It's already established, so it's not affected by this freeze memo. The other rule, the contract clause rule, implements the CMMC program in defense contracts by specifying which CMMC level is required for an offerer to take award of the contract based on the type of covered data involved in that contract. And because contract clauses are themselves regulations, and they're codified in Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, we often refer to this rule as the 48 CFR CMMC rule. Anyways, the proposed version of the contract clause rule was published on August 15th of 2024. The public had 60 days to submit their comments on the rule, and since that time, the DoD has been adjudicating those comments and going about the normal rulemaking process that happens in the background that nobody ever gets to see. Based on average DoD rulemaking timeline since 2009, the CMMC contract clause final rule would be published in June of 2025 and go into effect in August of 2025. Now, there's good reason to believe, as we've talked about on multiple episodes before this, that the rule could be published sooner and go into effect sooner, but being published by March 21st is definitely pretty unlikely in my analysis and estimate. So it's going to fall outside of this freeze memo, but it's still going to undergo regulatory review, because regulatory review is a normal part of the rulemaking process. The only thing that happens with these freeze memos is that the new administration puts their reviewers in place for rules that are already on deck. That's all it's doing. It's not inventing a new review process. It's just bridging the review process between personnel as the administrations change.
So again, what I'm hearing is that every single rule that needs to be pertinent to us is either the step in the timeline that may have it affected by the regulatory freeze has either already passed or will not happen by the time this freeze is over. Is that
correct? The regulatory freeze memo doesn't change anything about the regulatory review process that all CMMC rules and all rules in general have to go through. This doesn't freeze the program specifically. It doesn't freeze the rulemaking process in general for every rule that's happening. It's just making sure that rules that were reviewed by the previous administration are reviewed by the incoming administration prior to them being published or going into effect. It's not changing anything about the rulemaking process. But to that point about regulatory review, these rules get reviewed for regulatory review regardless. Like OMB,
and then people that have watched the show submitted to OIRA for review. That is the point where it would qualify it for this freeze, right?
It is such a big deal, and it is such a massive core part of rulemaking that we literally do entire episodes whenever one of these rules goes up for regulatory review, because it's one of the few times that you get a clear guidepost on the progress and timeline of the rule that allows you to estimate what's going on in the process. But regardless, whether it were subject to the freeze memo and re-review, whether it went through review in the last administration, whether it's going through review in this current administration, regardless of when it goes through review, all of these CMMC rules and all the rules in general do go through review. The operative term in this memo is not when it's being reviewed. It's whether or not there are substantial questions of fact, law, or policy. And it is extremely difficult to imagine substantial questions of fact, law, or policy when CMMC is clearly rooted in all three of those things. It is a fact that the lack of external verification for cybersecurity requirements imposed by DFARS Clause 252-204-7012 for the last 12 years has led to direct national security harms by allowing widespread systemic non-compliance with minimum cyber requirements for covered DoD data that is tantamount to straight up fraud. That is a fact. It is, and as far as the law goes, CMMC is a program created pursuant to a crystal clear statutory requirement in Section 1648 of the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act, thanks to the Armed Services Committee demanding contractor accountability for the fact that they're not compliant with their obligations and it's causing national security harms. And then finally, CMMC isn't just a Trump era policy. It's an extension of cyber policy that has transcended multiple diametrically opposed administrations back to back to back. But here's the real kicker. This freeze memo is not unique. It's what we talked about at the beginning. Freeze memos at this point are common practice. They've happened for so long, they might as well be an institutional part of the actual rulemaking process. There has been a regulatory freeze memo at the start of every new administration since George W. Bush. Literally every single one has a memo issued by the president's chief of staff.
I don't want to give it away, but like it's just, hey, you put out your LinkedIn post, and I was like, wait, I know the answer to this. I know when this was released. I know when it was signed. Wait a minute, let me Google real quick. Hold on, wait. There's more than one result. Wait, there's multiple results.
Fun fact,
these results happen on the same day.
Spoiler alert for anybody that if the poll isn't closed by the time you watch this, the memo that I posted on LinkedIn is fake. It's actually a combination of excerpts from every freeze memo that's been issued since 2001 to 2025. The answer really is banana, because there was the original freeze memo.
Wait, for once in history, the answer is actually banana.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the original freeze memo was something known as the Card memo, issued by Mr. Card, the chief of staff at the time, on January 20th, 2001. There was another one on January 20th, 2009, just called Regulatory Review, doing the same thing. There was another one on January 20th, 2017, the one that was originally called the Freeze Memo. There was another one on January 20th, 2021, called Regulatory Freeze Pending Review. And now there's one on January 20th, 2025 by the exact same name, Regulatory Freeze Pending Review. And almost all of these copy and paste the wording from the previous memo from a different administration for the same thing. This is not unique. It is not an indictment of the CMMC rule. It's not even an indictment of the rulemaking process in general. People are wildly misinterpreting what this memo is actually doing, and they are completely ignoring the history of these freeze memos over time. But here's the real question, right? So how did CMMC, a deeply unpopular Trump-era rule, not only make it through the Trump-era vicious cutbacks to rulemaking under their first administration, but also make it through the regulatory freeze memo under the Biden administration? That happened because there aren't substantial questions of fact, law, or policy when it comes to CMMC, or the reasons why it exists in the first place, and the reasons why it continues to exist across different administrations, right? Period. End of story. Yeah, simplest analysis we've ever done on this show.
I think it's the most straightforward way that we have put that into terms. It's kind of like in anybody familiar with the TV show The Wire. At one point in time, the Baltimore police are investigating corrupt politicians and money laundering schemes and stuff like that. And one politician's in question, and the police lieutenant, Lieutenant Daniels, goes, simply put, if you aren't doing anything wrong, there is nothing for you to be worried about, right? If you are not committing fraud, there's nothing for you to be worried about, right or wrong.
It's an apt example of maybe how the DOJ would approach the issue for sure, and which is a whole other topic that we've talked about before, and I'm sure we're going to talk about in the future. But long story short, the freeze memo is important, but it's only a big deal for rulemaking in general and for CMMC specifically if you have an extremely short memory, right? That's the only reason why you would interpret this as being some massive referendum on CMMC specifically, which is a real shame. But that's what we do on this show, is we spend the time to try to paint the context going back more than 6 months so that people can understand what's going on. So just to wrap up, regulatory review is a normal and important part of the rulemaking process, regardless of when it happens. During administration, transitions between administrations, doesn't matter. This is why we highlight regulatory review as one of the few available indicators of how rules are progressing through the system and the rulemaking process that allows us to extrapolate knowable timelines for people to strategize their CMMC, DFARS, cybersecurity, NIST cybersecurity requirement strategies, right? You can extrapolate from this weird, obscure process actual tangible timelines, actual budget considerations for when you're going to do what and what you're going to spend on, so on and so forth. Sure. The Office of Management and Budget, specifically the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, as we've talked about many, many times, conducts regulatory review of every rule under the authorities granted to them by the Paperwork Reduction Act, Executive Order 12866, which was from the Clinton administration, and a bunch of others. It's just to name a few. There's a couple of exceptions to this, like emergency rules and aviation safety directives from the FAA, but they're pretty few and far between. Regulatory freezes at this point are a standard part of rulemaking that happens every time there's a new administration. It doesn't change the process of regulatory review. It just changes when the review happens, when the staff changes over. So whether or not it gets reviewed now or when it's published or later on, the real question is, are there substantial questions about fact, law, and policy? And as far as CMMC is concerned, there are not. And we can see that that's true based off the history of the program going through rulemaking and previous regulatory freezes. That's it. So see y'all next week.
Yeah, see you next week.